do that. So welcome everyone to the Week in Dialogue with the Author webinar today. My name is Dawn Dole. I'm with the Taus Institute. The Taus Institute is sponsoring this program this week, and thank you to all of you who participated online in the Taus online community webpage with Diana and Amanda this week. If you were not able to join the dialogue online during the week, that dialogue is still open. You're welcome to go there and see the conversation that unfolded this week. It was just wonderful and lots of good sharing and good questions, and it was a wonderful experience to see unfold. The Taus Institute sponsors these weekend dialogues with the author about every other month, and this is our 5th one in this series. Some of you have participated in the others, and if you'd like to participate in the future, they are free and they get us just engaged with each other in lots of different ways, online and in these webinars. The Taus Institute is a nonprofit educational organization. We are focusing on bringing practitioners and scholars together, academics and students, to look at how we construct our reality together. You know, how do we look at making meaning together through a relational process? And we work with people in many, many different disciplines: families, communities, organizations, healthcare, education, all around the world. And we invite you to participate in any of our programs. We have conferences, we have workshops, we have a PhD program, we have online distance learning programs. We send out newsletters and resources and books. We have publishing arms. So there's many, many ways to get involved, and we welcome all of you. This call today is with Diana Whitney and Amanda Trosten-Bloom, and I want to introduce them. Diana is a global social entrepreneur. She's a founder and co-founder and president of the Corporation for Positive Change, co-founder for the Taus Institute, thus the name Taus, which is in New Mexico, and Diana was living in New Mexico at the time the Taus Institute was born, and she is a key player in making that happen. And thank you, Diana, for being a part of the very beginning. She works as a consultant and a practitioner in education, businesses, families, and communities. She's a founding advisor for the United Religions Initiative, a global network of over 530 interfaith cooperation circles working for peace and justice. She's a speaker, a writer. She's written numerous articles and books. She's worked with hundreds of thousands of people worldwide who live and lead using appreciative inquiry. She is described as one of the top 5 thought leaders in the field, forging a positive revolution that is radically transforming knowledge, understanding, and practice in human organizing, leadership, and management for the good of all people. And thank you, Diana, for being a part of this week. Amanda Trosten-Bloom draws upon 25 years of organizational consulting and management experience in the areas of organizational change and human resource development. She's been engaged in long-term whole systems change using appreciative inquiry in a variety of business and social profit settings. Her work especially focuses on the areas of culture transformation, strategic planning, leadership development, and business improvement. Using a variety of AI practices, Amanda aligns widely diverse groups of stakeholders around issues of strategic intent, action, and profitability. And welcome, Amanda, to our Week in Dialogue. Both of you, we love your book, Appreciative Leadership, and I just have used it over the years, and it's been one of the great resources in my bookshelf, and just have loved it. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to turn the call over to the two of you.
Thank you, Dawn. We are so excited to be doing this call. The week was fabulous. Some people had an easier time of it than others. I was among those who had technology troubles, but the dialogue was great. Want to say thank you to you and your team for making this possible. and to the Taos Institute. Thank you to all of the people who participated with us in the online dialogue, and we are just delighted to be here with all of you who are online now. We've talked about how to begin, and to have everyone introduce themselves would probably take up the entire hour and 15 minutes that we're going to spend with you. But we would like to hear some voices. And the way we'd like to do that today is we would like to have each person in their language say, "May peace prevail on earth." We don't want to hear it 10 times in English. We want one person to say it in English, one person to say it in Japanese, one person to say it in Spanish. So if you will, please, Papusa, would you begin for us? May peace prevail on earth.
Que la paz prevalezca en este mundo.
Memi.
地上に平和がありますように。
Amalia, perhaps in Norwegian.
Måtte freden med alle mennesker på jord.
And I don't know the other languages that are with us today, so please join in if you have another language.
Shanti.
Låt det vara fred på jorden.
Den vrede op aarde wees.
Que la paix triomfe sur la terre.
Խաղաղություն բոլոր աշխարհի մեջ.
Thank you. I think I heard about 10 different languages. May peace prevail on earth. Taos is an extraordinary global community. We have these opportunities to come together and to really live into the kinds of questions that we ask of each other and that the world asks of us. So today, Amanda and I are going to talk about the content of our book. We're going to talk first a bit about what really touched us about the online dialogue. We're going to talk then about how did our book come about. We're going to situate it in our work as consultants. We're going to talk about kind of the essential messages of the book. And I'm actually going to link that in with some understandings of social constructionism and leadership that I put on the chat this week as 5 moves and shifts in leadership. And then we're going to talk about how do we think that these notions of appreciative leadership, what do they have to offer the field of leadership and perhaps the world? We are planning to be with you for another hour, so an hour and a half altogether. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Amanda, who's going to have some reflections for us based on the online chat this week.
Diana. So we spent some time roaming around and being in dialogue with a number of you who came into the online chat earlier in the week. And both of us wanted to take just a few minutes to think about some of the highlights of that, what stood out for us, what was provocative, some of the questions and curiosities that we came out with after we had a chance to read your questions and curiosities. So I'd like to start with the first thing that I noticed in the first day or so that we were together. And that was that though we're having a dialogue about appreciative leadership, that much of the conversation began around appreciative inquiry, as if the two were interchangeable. And I wanted to talk a little bit about my understanding some of the appreciative leadership might build a different than appreciative inquiry. So let me share for a moment the story of how our book came about, because I think that will give all of you a sense of how we might hold the differences between them. We started thinking about leadership when we were writing the book, The Power of Appreciative Inquiry, in 2003. We started thinking about it and thinking about what does it take to lead positive change. And as we thought about that, we went back and we interviewed a number of leaders with a capital L, who we knew had been very successful in those environments. And we began to see some patterns in the sorts of things that they did, the ways that they carried themselves in the world and in their organization, that seemed to amplify the effects of appreciative inquiry. One of those, for example, was that they were fully committed to the positive. Another one was that they were personally involved. They joined with others to create something. They believed in inclusion. There were several things that we outlined in the introduction to our book that we discovered in those interviews with leaders. So we thought about the leaders themselves, and then Diana, shortly after that, founded this program, this wonderful program that we're still teaching called the Appreciative Leadership Development Program. She got curious about what would it take to have a wholly affirmative, wholly strength-based process for developing leaders, for developing leadership. And I'm going to begin to make a shift around the way that I talk about this, from leaders to leadership. And this program included a lot of interviews, not surprisingly. It took a 4D cycle and it applied it to people's personal leadership. And it included pre-work. It included people interviewing leaders that they respected greatly. And they came in with this data to look at what they were learning from people who were practicing leadership in a way that had made a positive difference in their lives and in the lives of others. We began to see some patterns in that as well. And out of that was born this whole notion of 5 strategies, the 5 strategies that are outlined in our book, which we'll talk about a little bit further. These strategies and some practices that people were doing that was making a difference, that was bringing out the best in others whenever they did them. So then we got even more curious, and we decided to go out and do some focus groups. We collected input between the interviews and the focus groups with hundreds of people. There were 10 focus groups where we went out and explored what does positive power mean to you, and what brings it out? What makes it happen? And it was out of all of this data, if you'll have it, this data that we collected first informally and then more formally, that the notion of appreciative leadership as a relational practice, appreciative leadership as a process that brings out the best in others and creates winning results. That's where all of this was born. Now, when we go into the book, we notice that there are a number of practices that echo appreciative inquiry. They echo appreciative inquiry. Part of that is that our data initially came out of appreciative inquiry and looking at people who were leading and doing leadership in that context. But that's not all that's there. Appreciative leadership, it takes the practice of appreciative inquiry and puts some legs on it in terms of how each of us carry ourselves in the world, what we can do to make a positive difference, whether we're a leader with a capital L or whether we're a leader with a small L, whether we're talking about leading others or whether we're talking about personal leadership, leading ourselves, which leads into sort of a second big theme that I was struck with in the online dialogue, and that was that a number of people were talking about leadership, leaders as people, as opposed to leadership, which is a relational practice in our experience. And what we really leaned into in the book was the notion of leadership. In fact, I can recall, Diana, over and over us going back through trying to, how are we going to talk about individuals in this book when really what we're talking about is a relational process. And so we did in the book tease out practices that we as individuals could take on. But more importantly, we tried to lean into what happens between people that creates these positive ripples in the world, that unleashes positive power, both in those people that are involved and in the world around them. So those were two big items that showed up in here. There was a third theme that I want to speak to. It had to do with, what do we do when someone doesn't want to do, to change the way that we think is best for them? In other words, when we can't get organizations or leaders with a capital L to buy Appreciative Inquiry. That was a conversation that happened with some regularity online. And one of the things that I found myself stepping back into in the midst of that conversation is, again, the notion of appreciative leadership as the way that I carry myself, the way that I think, the way that if I'm a consultant, I enter into an organization, into a dialogue, into a conversation about what needs to happen in this organization and what is it you're trying to create. And how might we create that together? And what are some of the practices or tools that we might bring to bear here? Not everybody believes in this. Not everybody believes in this. I happen to. Diana happens to. We find this to be a powerful way of engaging in the world. That doesn't mean that everybody else does. And so appreciative leadership speaks something to how we carry ourselves, even when we are in an environment that doesn't see things the way that we see things. So those were the three things that really stood out for me in the online dialogue. Did anything else, Diana, stand out for you that you want to speak to?
No, I love that summary. I wish I had thought of it.
So then there was one other long thread that happened online that I'd like to lean into and actually invite Diana into a longer reflection about this. In our dialogue online, she came out with something she described as 5 moves, something that was different about appreciative leadership, a different way of looking at things. That was a different way of explaining something about what's in the essence of our book. And Diana, I'd like to suggest that you take a chunk of time here now talking a little more about these 5 moves that you were beginning to play with. And everybody, while Diana's talking, I'd like to invite you to be chatting questions, because I'm going to be tracking questions that are coming in, and then she and I might start talking about those after she's finished talking about the 5 moves and the book.
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you. I just really want to reinforce Amanda's notion that the book came to us through a kind of research process. because I know many of you who are on this call are graduate students at Taos or elsewhere. And so we really took our own observation and created more and more opportunities to reflect on them, learn with other people. The 5 moves, I was having trouble technically getting online this week. And so I was sitting there thinking, and for me, one of the foundational bits of appreciative leadership is social constructionism. It's also, for me, foundational to appreciative inquiry. It's why I feel called to it and why I believe it's successful. And so as I thought about this, it's what does social constructionism mean to me? If I were to say there's some things that we understand about social constructionism, and I wonder what they have to say, what they invite us to in terms of leadership. Well, the first move is from that sense of individual behaviors to relational ways of being or being in relationship. Now, Amanda touched on it, and so did many people in our online discussion. We're not saying there's no such thing as a person with the title leader. We're not saying that you don't exist as an individual. But what we've learned is that a great deal, if not most, of the leadership literature in the past has been about the leader, the traits that make he or she, most often a he, a good leader, and how the behaviors of that kind of person. And those behaviors are often the question that Jim asked repeatedly this week. How do those behaviors correlate with results? And so when we take a relational stance, we begin to ask different kinds of questions. Like, what's happening that allows us to go forward together? You know, whose results are we talking about? Have those people who are going to be impacted by the results, whatever they are, had a voice, a say in identifying what would be considered desirable results and in helping to create them. And so one of the moves that I find interesting is to shift my own language from talking about he or she or I to we, to ours, and to really begin to speak in the plural. And that it does a number of things. It, one, helps me remember that there are other people that I'm engaging with. It also creates a kind of invitation to other people to be part of the we. You know, if I say my thoughts or I have this idea, it's very hard for someone to be part of that. But if I say, you know, we've been in conversation this week, I'm wondering what we might do about it, there's an invitational quality that really ties into what we've talked about in the book in terms of inclusion. Now, at this point, I could talk about the relational for a very long time. But what I want to do is actually read our definition of appreciative leadership on page 3 of the book. So we say appreciative leadership is a relational capacity. We kind of located in the relationship or the relationships to mobilize creative potential and turn it into positive power. Now, what's really interesting is that as we began talking about leadership and writing, I went to the dictionary and looked up the word power, because I was kind of tired of the narrative that power is a bad thing. I mean, there are times in my life when I like feeling powerful. I like getting things, you know, accomplished. And the word power is kind of simple. It means achievement. It means results. It means accomplishing. So I think it's not power that's been troublesome, but the nature of power. and the individualistic notion of power. And so we kind of set out in the book to offer a hypothesis that maybe there could be an understanding of more appreciative, positive power. And that this notion of results, again, Amanda was introduced as having 25 years of experience. I guess I have to own up to my as many years. But over the years, what we've noticed is results are not a straight path. It's not like we do something today, we have this webinar, and tomorrow you will be doing things different. Results are a ripple. Something happens. You have a little bit of an aha. You try, we experiment, we do things different, we see how it works. It's where Frank Barrett's work on improvisation is so important. Results come down a different path than we may have predicted, in different ways than we may have thought, and certainly in a timing that is not always ours. So appreciative leadership really, again, is an invitation to look at impact as a rippling process, something that moves through relationships, and that maybe the best result is that the relationship is intact, it's stronger, if there's such a thing, and it continues and we go forward together. So this notion of positive power setting in motion ripples of confidence, energy, enthusiasm, and performance that make a difference in the world. All of our interviews, in focus groups, with people in our workshops, the people want to make a difference. Whether they're the baby boomers who are my age, who were protesting in the 60s because we wanted a better world, or the millennials now who are saying, how can my job help me make a better world? And I'll share a very funny personal story. I sent my daughter a text late yesterday, and I said, what are we doing for Mother's Day? And she sent me back a picture of Hillary Clinton. Now, there's a stretch to understand what that means. I knew what it meant. I knew that she couldn't respond to my text because she was volunteering at a Hillary Clinton event right then. So it made perfectly good sense to me. But would that make sense to everybody? Probably not. And that's the other piece that I sort of wrote about here in, I think from, maybe it was number 2, but looking at language as our vehicle for creating futures. You know, we talk in Appreciative Inquiry world, we say words create worlds. Ken's wonderful article on research as making, as opposed to mirroring reality, that language is always located in the context of the people who are speaking. But as we offer up different words or a photograph instead of a verbal response, we create new potentials. And it's those new potentials that also have us being. I want to also add to Amanda's distinctions about appreciative inquiry and appreciative leadership and point you to a table on page 22. We wrote about 8 surprising sources of positive power and of positive potential. Now, some of these you're going to say, oh, of course, strengths, past success. But here's one, cynicism. Cynicism is a great source of potential. Big emotions. You know those people that we would call drama queens? Well, inside of that drama, there's something important that has potential. It may not be used in the way it's articulated, but there's something to listen to. Edgy ideas, connectivity. Every time we make a new connection with a new person, there's potential. Opposition. Opposition is a tremendous source of positive potential and novelty. So again, we'll come back to this, but the book holds an understanding that the world isn't all the way we want it to be, and that what we're inviting is a willingness to look at many different ideas and ways of being. And so you can, that one little table gives you a sense of it. So the first move was to the relational. The second is language as aspirational. The third is a shift in from power over people to power with people. And again, Amanda touched on that. It really has to do with, are the people whose future it is in the conversation. We talk about holism. We talk about being systemic. We can't have everybody in the whole world always in this one conversation. That would be kind of an interesting thing to go for. But we can, when there's a topic of importance or a change that is being proposed, we can engage with people, not just for them to give us reflections on our ideas, but to really hear what they care about, what they would do if they were the king or queen for the day. And so appreciative leadership is really about engaging with. And we've had the good fortune to work with people who are leaders, Rick Pellet, Dave Eric at British Airways, who actually came and joined, sat at the table, and had dialogue with the people in their organizations. And that perhaps is one of the biggest things that we can offer to leadership, is to create an inclusive situation. The fourth move is really very congruent with appreciative inquiry, the strengths movement, positive psychology, and that is to shift from deficit discourse to appreciative discourse. And I've been thinking about this one, and this morning I thought, it is so simple, and yet we don't do it. But it is so simple to listen to what people have to say, to observe, and to take what we like, what we find meaningful, what works for us, and to go forward with it. But so often we stop, and we don't just see what's useful to us, we see everything else that we don't like, and we waste our time talking about it. And we see everything that from our point of view won't work, and we waste our time talking about it. And I'm really purposeful when I say we waste our time, because I think, we're living in this world where we're very ecologically sensitive to the environment. We need to recycle, we need to reuse, we need to not harm the environment. Well, I want to put forth that there is something called language pollution, and that we spend much too much time using words that really are critical, put down, harmful, instead of simply saying what we care about, what's useful to us, what we think is good, and then moving on and allowing other people to have their words and their ways of doing things. Because every time we find ourselves needing to critique, what we're really doing is saying there is a right and a wrong way. And that's one of the things, as constructionists, we try to hold the space that there are a lot of different ways. And for different people, different ways will be meaningful. I had two grandmothers who were fabulous cooks, and one of them could make a fabulous apple pie. And the other probably could not make a pie because she was from Italy and she didn't even probably know what pie meant, but she could make homemade pasta. Now, do I judge one and critique one? for not making pies and the other for not making homemade pasta? No, I go have dinner at both of their houses, and I love their food. So this notion of our own capacity, and it is a relational capacity, to see something wonderful, and wonder being that curiosity, something we can wonder about as a practice, and then appreciate it and let go of all the rest. Now, it's really, really hard to do. I know that. I have one friend who used to say, every once in a while, we have to have a good cup of coffee and judge earthlings harshly. And she was joking about that. But we have habits of judgment, habits of criticism, habits of finding what's wrong. And what appreciative leadership is inviting us to do is to move into the habits of finding what are we curious about? What's useful to us? What's useful to us to go forward together? So that shift to appreciative discourse is really essential. Stop being a word polluter. That's my new, got to make a bumper sticker. And then building on that is the fifth move, and which we are moving from organization change and transformation, from an idea that we're trying to go to some place that is the right way, to the idea that we are trying to create organizations, communities, and situations that are infinitely capable of being relationally rich and honoring the diversity of cultures and people and foods and music. And so much of our literature on leadership and organization, there's a set of competencies. So if we have this list of competencies and we develop everybody to be able to do these things, behave in this way, the world will be better. Well, that logic led to, I don't even want to go there, but harming people because their ways weren't the way we wanted them to be. And so appreciative leadership is a bold, bold invitation to accept people just as they are, whether they're on the autism spectrum, whether they're wearing a hijabi or not, whether they're young or old. But it is also an invitation for us to face the limits of our acceptance of diversity. I mean, that's a relational challenge for all of us, to make friends with the others. So those are 5 moves, 5 things that I think social constructionist invites us to. Social constructionism, I should say. In terms of appreciative leadership, we offer 5 strategies, as Amanda said. And on page 23, we list them and we name them. And the book goes on to really provide a wide range of practices. The first, I say, of course, is inquiry. Today, I received a little blurb, a little article from Fast Company, and it says, the good conversationalists listen more than they talk. And we say that in the book. It's a practice. The second of the strategies is illumination, shining the light so that we can bring out the best of other people. And by the way, by shining the light, we are bringing out our own best as well. You know, my son likes to say his good angels, but it's when our good angels show up that we really invite the good angels of others. Inclusion, finding ways to truly invite other people to co-create the future. Not to do what you want them to do, not to help you make what you want to come real, but to really say, what is it that you want your world to be like? Inspiration. We talk about what is it? What are the practices that really awaken the creative spirit, that support and nurture innovation, creativity, and those positive human emotions like hope? And the fifth strategy is integrity. And I do invite you, if you've not already, to read the book, because we define it as making decisions for the good of the whole. Integrity for us isn't so much about a person who's honest. That's kind of an assumption, or truth-telling, but it's about being with people in ways that we can say what we've done benefited the whole. I have a longtime friend, Dinesh Chandra, and he said, you know, win-win is not good enough. It has to be win-win, win-win, win-win-win. Everybody's got to find something that's meaningful to them. So those are the 5 strategies. And Amanda, I think I should stop here and we should take questions. What do you think?
I think that's a good idea.
Okay.
So I've been tracking along the way, and there's several good questions and comments that have come in, and there's a few more that are coming in along as you're addressing some of the. I'll keep my eyes on the chat box.
Okay, I only want easy ones.
All right, I'll give you the easy ones, and then I'll give you the hard ones, and we'll rest.
No, it's okay.
This was a good one that builds a lot on what you were just talking about with the 5 strategies. Christoph asked, how do we effectively and efficiently and practically on an ongoing basis include all the stakeholders in the conversation about what's best for all of us? So he's really, he's asking this question. I think he's probably leaning into what we're describing as inclusion and the practices of inclusion. Why don't you speak a little more about that for a moment, and then I'll keep going with more questions.
Well, and also perhaps you'll jump in.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's a very important question, and I'm actually going to answer it more from a personal story than an organizational one. Because I think to do it, Christoph, we have to push against a lot of systems and structures that are in place that exclude people. So my personal story is, I think most of you know, and you don't have to go, my mom passed in August. So it's not been a year. I have 2 brothers. Collectively, we have 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 nieces and nephews. And we have my mom's estate to settle. The first thing that happened was that her lawyer sent us a stack of documents that were about 3 inches thick. And I consider myself a smart person, and I couldn't deal with it. I didn't want to deal with it. And so my one brother and I talked. We also have a brother who has been diagnosed as schizophrenic. And so how we engage him in dialogue is a huge challenge for me. But what we did in this case is we first found a mediator who would help us in conversations if we needed a mediator. I should say we first reached out to all of our friends and family and said, you know, this is going on. Join our conversation. We had conference calls with all the nieces and nephews so that they could all know what's happening. So here we are trying to do something, divide up a little bit of money, something that the systems would invite us to be competitive and greedy about. And we're saying we want to do this in a way that nurtures our family relationships, that cares for a brother who's not well and is angry at us, and we don't really understand reasons. And so we have a mediator on our team. We haven't used the mediator yet. And we found a lawyer who would work collaboratively. And he said, in our state, which is Florida, where this is going on, we don't do collaborative family law. We do collaborative divorces. There is a movement. And that's kind of fun. But we don't do, but some of us are interested in it. We'd be willing and interested in working with you so that we could see and learn what it's like to be part of a team that collaborates in making decisions that are going to support everybody. And so it's been very hard at times because the lawyer, even though we adore him and we are comfortable with him, he writes in a way that it hurts my brain to read all this legalese. So then we have to take a step back and say, okay, tell us now what it's saying. So we are really engaging in it, but we are also pushing up against things in this country that are considered laws. And we've had to really talk about what kind of risks we're willing to take legally in order to benefit relationally. So that's an example that's very personal. Amanda, you might have one that is more work-related if you'd like. Can't hear you.
Thank you. I forgot to unmute myself. Excuse me. I find myself thinking about, first off, a number of the practices that we outline in the chapter on inclusion that are very sort of practical practices about how to do this. And I think also about some of the ways that we actively engage people when we're doing appreciative inquiry processes, which bleed over in terms of how we could be doing these on a day in, day out basis when we're not consulting. So obviously we have interviews and informal conversations. We have opportunities to put people who aren't normally in relationship with each other into conversation so that they can hear each other and hear what they have, what's similar and what's different about the way that they think about things. I think about restorative justice, which has become much bigger in the United States, where when a wrong has been committed, that everybody who has been affected comes together to talk about what has happened here and how to repair the harm. And this is one more example of a relational practice that brings those who, the term you use, Diana, regularly is the people whose future it is, or the people who are affected, into an ongoing conversation. And this is one of the things I'd like to say that remains a stretch for me, because I still have a desire to sort of get to an endpoint, to finish something, to close it up, to say, box it up and put it on the shelf. And there's this whole notion that I have to keep reminding myself that the conversation doesn't ever close. The conversation isn't over. We may have made a decision, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to keep talking about that decision. We're not going to revisit that decision. So that would be the addition that I would make to what you talked.
I think that last note about the conversation continuing is important, because as we design processes for organizations and communities, we're really looking at it as iterative inclusion. You know, we're not saying let's get everybody involved at the same time. It may be that the school children need to be involved in a playful way at a certain time, and then their parents and faculty get involved later, and some of the school kids join in a larger meeting. I think there's one thing that's really important. Amanda and I wrote about this in The Power of Appreciative Inquiry, and I'm really going to keep emphasizing, if you want to learn about appreciative inquiry, read The Power of Appreciative Inquiry, read the book David and I wrote on Appreciative Inquiry, A Positive Revolution. Taus published a book by Frank Barrett and Ron Fry. Read a book about appreciative inquiry. If you're interested in how constructionism and appreciative inquiry kind of influence the notion, the leadership, what's going on in the world of leadership, then look at our book Appreciative Leadership, which is what we're talking about. Yup DeLong, who's on this call, is doing his dissertation and doing some amazing videos with people that are sort of talked about as appreciative leaders, and he's going to have some more insights. We're beginning to build this field. Ralph Weichel, another colleague, is doing research on the results of an appreciative leadership development program. But appreciative leadership doesn't equate to appreciative inquiry.
Yes.
And so it's an important, sometimes subtle distinction. Yes, Papusa said the Public Conversation Project, another wonderful process. So there are many processes: open space, World Cafe, real-time strategic change. There are a lot of organizational processes that help us include people in conversations.
Great. Well, let me move us to another comment that was made on here. You actually commented that wanted us to sort of reflect on the challenge of moving from I to we in a society that still really embraces and values individualism. Talk for a minute about how you see this emerging in our relatively individualistic society.
Well, you know, in so much, that's at the heart of things. As a very young consultant, I remember learning about group process, and that there's always, each of us always has a need to belong, to be part of the we, but to also be differentiated, to be I. And so this I-we is a dynamic that has been alive in the field of organization development, in group process, and certainly now in our work for a long, long time. So we've written in this book about take care of yourself so you can take care of others. And it so much depends on the people you are working with. Some of you have worked with groups of women, and you may find that women more often will tend to be caretakers of others and put the we first. And so there often needs to be a way for them to feel okay about being I, and also to learn some skills. I find that when I'm working in Asia. You know, our colleague Dorothy in Hong Kong, our colleagues in Japan, there is a sort of cultural tendency toward the we. And what appreciative inquiry and then appreciative leadership allows is people to find their voice. In other cultures, like the Western world, the I is just really so strong that it has been called narcissistic. And so a lot of people are doing therapy and working with that individualism as a psychological problem. I think it's a spectrum. I think it's another one of those things that we want to embrace both. Years ago when I lived in Taos, I remember saying to my friend Patricia, "How are you?" And she, because she lived in the Pueblo and is Native American, she said, "We're fine." So for her, a concept of I is not there. And so I think it's a really important question. We're not saying there's no personal self. What I became aware of this morning, again, as I was reflecting, is the world starts, however, with the other. We are born of relationships. It doesn't start with the self and move to relationships. It's relationships are there, and hence I am.
Diana, let me build on what you're talking about right now. So and this is a notion that's very prominent in social construction, that we are sort of a composite of the relationships, the experiences, the contexts in which we've lived. Now, so to go back to that original question about how do we deal with this in an individualistic society, that one of the ways we deal with this is by working with it within ourselves to understand our own context and where we evolved from, and how we are changed, how we are informed by everything that goes on around us, and everyone with whom we come into contact, how they create us, how they influence and create who we become from that point forward. And that the next piece that I think of then is, how do we engage others in conversations that help them to see that larger context as well? I'm remembering, Diana, for example, the opening interview from the first United Religions Summit, where people were invited to go back and look at their histories and what formed or informed how they thought about things, what they believed about the world. So that's the other thing that comes up for me with respect to this question or this comment.
I know you and I have talked a little bit about what's going on in the United States in terms of the political campaign. Mm-hmm. And I began wondering, as I was hearing you, is Bernie Sanders, what would happen if instead of talking about him as a person, we talked about him as a narrative?
Interesting.
He's a dominant narrative in the United States right now. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump is a dominant, prominent narrative. Mm-hmm. Hillary Clinton is a narrative. I wonder what that would do for us if instead of locating everything on the person, we looked at it as these are narratives that are playing out. They're somewhat in conversation with each other or not. And so that just raises an interesting question. Joop, if you're still on, I would actually love to hear your thoughts on this.
Mm-hmm. Let's see I believe he is on, because he's been texting. Joop, maybe you can unmute yourself if you want to add anything.
Or tell us you don't want to. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, thank you. First of all, can you hear me? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me. I guess I'd like to go back to the part where I raised the question, because I'm very interested in, and I guess that links then maybe to the narratives that you just mentioned, Diana and Amanda, is how can we live this in our world? That's probably where really my question came from. And I'm right now in South Africa, where I find a high context society, and we're much more in the we and in the narratives. And you talked about Asia, Diana, where there, by the way, I guess other power dynamics, but there is also very much the we. And I got intrigued by when I heard you speak on what we actually could do to lower the threshold and get more people involved in this notion of that we together will have to realize the results. And I guess that is probably where it's very interesting to see, for a foreigner like me, to see the American politics, where people like Mr. Trump actually seem to go the opposite direction. It's I, and then there is a long silence, and then there is more I. So I'm really intrigued by what you just said, and my hope is that if we can shift this notion indeed to the we. That's why I was also so much enjoying to hear about your moves, and I wrote a comment to Amanda saying, isn't that much more generic? It's not only dealing with leadership. Some of the things we're talking here are not only about leadership, but they are just more in general how we behave towards each other, how we deal with one another. So it's so very fundamental when you said we come from relationships, and it's like here in South Africa working where they use the word Ubuntu and saying we are, or I am because you are. I am because we are in this conversation together, and still, although I think it's so obvious to probably most of us, I'm still wondering then what is the secret mechanism that will help us to overcome this hurdle of individualism. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
I think it's a great question. We should all just have it, because there are no absolute answers. Great. Dawn, I see that you're putting a lot on there about appreciative inquiry, and they're great resources. So thank you. It's wonderful to help people who still want to learn appreciative inquiry to know that there's tremendous, tremendous resources. Thank you. Amanda.
I'm looking at the time, and I'm thinking maybe one more question before we begin to wrap things up. And I've zeroed in on this one because it was something you referred to that I like, because it gives us an opportunity to show the practicality of this. This person said, cynicism is an opportunity. Can you talk more about practices that engage a cynical thinker, and what value or perspective a cynic brings to the process?
So you want me to answer that?
Well, I'd like to start.
Oh, good. Go for it.
I'd like to start, and then I'd like you to sort of wrap this up here. Our colleague, was it Peter Lang?
Yes.
Was the one who said that embedded in every complaint is a positive image of the future. People do not complain about things unless they see something better. And it's that gap, if you'll have it, between where we are and where they wish we would be, that creates that complaint. I might suggest that cynicism can also be born from disappointment. I have a client in Denver right now. It's a mental health center, and they have just built a facility on the grounds of what was in the 1960s the first African American mall in the country, that was subsequently fell into disrepair and was demolished, and all kinds of promises were made to redevelop this site that kept falling through for one reason or another. And so when it came time for this organization to develop the site, community members were saying, why should I even bother going to the meetings? This is just one more disappointment waiting to happen. And And the way that this client system dealt with this was to honor those cynical voices and to hear them out. The leaders, the members of this facility went out door to door. They knocked door to door to talk to people about what they hoped for this site, what would make their neighborhood a better neighborhood. They held community meetings. When complaints came up, people sat and listened and asked questions to understand them more. So I believe that maybe one of the answers, and by the way, this facility, when it opened with tremendous support in the community, in part because of the way that they managed that cynicism and those complaints and that resistance. I put resistance in air quotes here, that resistance that they hit when they first said they were going to buy the lot. So I believe that part of this is about how we hold that complaint. Do we hold it as if we have to defend ourselves? Do we hold it as if somebody's just a squeaky wheel and nothing's going to satisfy them? Do we hold it as if, how are we holding this? Are we holding this as something that has validity, that's important, that we need to understand better so that we can all have a different experience? If we can hold it in that way, if we can hold this as a collective challenge or opportunity, as opposed to somebody else's problem, I believe that that's one of the ways that we can manage this cynical response. Indeed, I think the term cynicism, it has a judgment attached to it. It suggests that it's not valuable or that they don't get what's right. And so the main message I take from this is that we need to remain open and inquisitive, and we need to continue to value that other way of seeing things. Di, what would you add?
Well, I agree with what you're saying, because ultimately, to appreciate is to accept everybody. And you've got to make choices about what's the best framework and format and who else to engage. But people, when we did our other little bit of research about why appreciative inquiry worked, one of the things people felt the freedom to be heard. It wasn't that I got to listen to somebody. I felt heard. And that's essential in all of this work. The other piece I want to say is, again, years and years ago as a young consultant, I came across a book, I think it's called You Just Don't Understand Me. And it's Deborah Tannen's book on gender communication. And she makes this really lovely story that when young boys want a baseball team, they just need, 9 players? Somebody help me with my sports here. And they don't care whether they like each other or not. They just want 9 players to make a team. Whereas little girls grow up and there's a whole different relational dynamic in which women learn to lament as a way of making relationships.
Oh.
So complaining becomes a relational bonding strategy. And I think when we talk relational, we need to understand different cultures. And what is it in different cultures that brings people together? When I taught appreciative inquiry, I believe for the first time in Japan, the Japanese habit is historically to go out drinking after work. You work long and hard during the day, and then you go out drinking after work to make your relationships and things like that. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that. So they said, well, let's have a little bar in the meeting room, at 9:00 at night. Okay, that was fine. And I went once until 9:15, went back to my room. But at the end of the week, there were comments like, now that I understand this, I think I'll be able to get married because I can make a relationship and I can choose to stay home with my wife. And so we're always working within cultures and understanding that in some ways we're pushing at the sacred cow of the person, the culture, the society, the group. And we don't want to push so much that we're insulting or we get pushed out, but we want to push a little so that everybody's going to learn and have a possibility for growth and change.
We're wrapping up, aren't we?
Yes. So our last question was to each other. Amanda, how do you think our book and the work on appreciative leadership that is beginning with, there's a community of people, appreciative leadership, relational leading, but what are we contributing to the field of leadership?
Oh, I love that question we came up with. So thank you for letting me speak to it first.
Please do.
The first thing that I believe we've contributed is a really very extensive repertoire of practices, very practical practices, things that you don't need to have a PhD for, you don't need to go through a 1-month leadership development program for, you don't need to have a personal coach for, a series of very pragmatic practices that, as I've worked coaching people, I've had them pick them out one a week to just try them out and then journal and see how it's affected things, what the impact has been. So I believe that that's one of the very practical contributions that we've made through this book. I also believe that this book speaks more directly to the challenges of the 21st century than a lot of what has been out there in the past. Partially because it was written now, not 20 years ago. We're in the context that we're in. But the world that we're living in right now, it's getting smaller and smaller in a way. And that we have the need to collaborate and make choices as a whole in order to survive as a species. Many of the issues around climate change are affecting the entire world. Many of the issues about water, around food, are affecting the entire world. And that we have spoken some to how to make those relationships and engage people across borders, across differences, in ways that has not always been spoken to in the past. And that isn't always spoken to in traditional leadership literature. Those are two things that I believe are important about the book that we've written. Do you have others you'd want to add beyond that?
Well, I think we have stretched ourselves and invited readers into a constructionist relational stance. The book is not about appreciative inquiry. It's about leadership. And it also has our values in it. And they are very much 21st century, accepting of people who are often different than us. So I think there's that to it. I find myself wanting to close with one thought, and that is something we wrote in The Power of Appreciative Inquiry. And it's about trusting the process that people will volunteer. As we become more and more, we want to engage people, we want to collaborate. My individual self only has a certain limit to my engagement and my collaboration. If I get one more request for surveys and feedback and I start barking at people. So the notion that in a world of great interconnectedness, in a world where we value that we're making the world as we go, We need to create ways for people to choose in and choose out, and that it's okay, because we can't all be everywhere, do everything all the time. So that's my kind of closing comments. And thank you. This was great fun.
Oh, indeed. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yeah, and this is Dawn. I want to, on behalf of the Taos Institute, I especially want to thank Diana Whitney and Amanda Trosten-Bloom for being with us for this week. And I would like to invite everyone to continue the conversation, continue learning together, to continue exploring together. Go back to the page of our Taos Online Community Space where this dialogue started on Monday, and engage. That page is going to be open forever. We will not close it, so please feel free to go, share stories, share questions, examples. We can keep expanding the appreciative leadership concepts, ideas, practices, and Diana and Amanda may pop in from time to time and keep an eye on that conversation, but really let's keep it alive. And I think some of the people on the chat feature made some comments just here at the end, how wonderful it was to be connected with this group around these ideas and practices. And it is wonderful. And I thank everyone for participating and invite you to continue.
Dawn, I also want to say that Dan Saint, who might be jumping off, and you are editing an edition of the Appreciative Inquiry Practitioner on leadership. And so there will be articles on appreciative leadership and leading, relational leadership. And so I'm encouraging people to definitely keep writing in our little Ning site, but that we may want to come back on and have another dialogue about constructionist-oriented leadership.
That would be great.
And so let's keep it alive. Thank you.
Yeah, and so what Diana's referring to is an online electronic journal called the AI Practitioner. If you are not a subscriber of that, just Google AI Practitioner and sign up to be a subscriber. It's an amazing journal that comes out a couple times a year. Yeah.
Oh, and that's Diana's little face. She's been taking trash and turning it into art. This is a good metaphor for the work that we do, right?
Right. Thank you, Amanda, for figuring out how I could share my little people.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a good rest of your day or evening, wherever you are in the world.
And thank you, Dawn, very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.